Glenn, how are you?
I'm great, Judge. How you doing?
Good. I'm pretty good, thank you. I thought we might just jump right in and sort of pick up on something that we left off last time when we talked a few weeks ago about your the piece that you did for Boston Review about punishment and race in the United States. As I've mentioned to you a few times, it's really gotten a huge amount of attention. It's
yes,
gotten
it
about
has.
it's about 60,000 people have looked at it on our website, but it's also been, as you know, reprinted on a bunch of other websites. And one of the things that has happened is that there have been as you know, there have been a bunch of comments on it, replies to it on our website, and I know you had some thoughts about those, but I thought just on the off chance that there's anybody who's watching and listening who doesn't know what's in the article, let me just do a quick review of what I saw as the four main points in it, and then talk about the conversations that it's provoked. So,
Okay.
So as I think about it, the 4 points are, first, that the United States puts a lot of people in jail, both a lot compared to other places and a lot compared to where the United States was 10, 20, 30 years ago. Secondly, that what explains the high levels of imprisonment is not really a rational social policy response to high levels of crime, but rather an increase in punitiveness. Third, that the willingness to go in for that increase in punitiveness has a lot to do with the fact that the imprisoned population is very heavily African American, more generally of color. And then fourth, and this is a little bit more fugitive than the other points, but extremely important, which is that people might think a little bit differently about criminality and punishment and the numbers of people who are in jail if they thought that there is a kind of a social compact in which individuals have a part to do and the political system and the social system has a part to do in making sure that people face decent conditions, and there's been a kind of a failure of collective responsibility, and not that that absolves any individuals of responsibility, but it might just make us think a little differently about those issues. Is that a fair?
That's brilliant, Judge. Thank you very much. I think the next time I give a lecture on this subject, I'll say just that.
Okay, that's good.
No, I think that's very fair. I mean, I want to stress that this is an important part of social policy in the country, that this is something that's going on a big scale, that in terms of the way that the government, the state, the way that people collectively act, relate to, marginal populations in the cities, particularly, this is it. I mean, this is the major social interface for example, African American men, high school dropouts, inner city dwellers, people who near do well, who are, in and out of the labor market and so forth. There's a very high likelihood that they're going to interface with this system. And it's grown by accretion and through all kinds of, different dynamics that historians and political scientists can talk about, and criminologists, and that it's hyper punitive. That, and in fact, the culture that surrounds punishment in the society, the way we do punishment, the way we do death, the way we react to atrocities that happen among us, we pass more laws and we get more punitive, and there's a kind of narrative that goes along with it about us and them, about the threat to social order. I mean, there's a kind of quest for social hygiene. There's a moralistic patina to the whole thing that is worth reflecting on. And
there was a guy who I met.
There
was a guy who I had lunch with a few days ago who now works with a group called the International Justice Mission, and he had spent, he told me, 7 years working on the Prison Fellowship, which I think is the Chuck Colson group. So this guy was as he described himself, very conservative, Christian, I suppose evangelical Christian, really a very good person. The work he's doing now in the International Justice Mission is very important. Anyway, he described his own turnaround on the imprisonment issue by having spent 7 years going and talking to people in prisons. And he said he went into this with a very strong as he again put it, very conservative attitude. He said he was all for 3 strikes and you're out, maybe 2 strikes and you're out. But he said the experience of being there had really turned his head. And when he talked about how it had turned his head, I thought, God, he's channeling Glenn here. There was a lot of stuff about people being in jail for nonviolent crimes. But the most important thing was that he said he would look at people on the other side of the bars and he would think, there but for the grace of God go I. And it was that sense that this isn't somebody who's, belongs to some other world than me, but, a fellow American, but maybe even more fundamentally a fellow human being. And there's something wrong with this situation. But you, I know, we've had a bunch of responses to the piece on the Boston Review website, and I know a few of them you were a little shocked by.
Well, they're interesting, and they're to a certain degree shocking. I think very revealing. I mean, one hesitates to extrapolate or draw any conclusion from the selective sample that you're going to get to people who choose to write into a blog, but. Still, I mean, the tone of some of it. I mean, there were just openly racist things were said. There were people who argued, the reason I'm making $300,000 a year is because I'm a good person and I did the right thing. These scumbags who threatened me. I mean, there were people who were saying, "Oh, look at the horrible crime that happened to a white lady in New York City. You see, that means some, scumbag is running around that we ought to." And I mean, these are caricatures of, something you'd expect out of a Clint Eastwood movie from the 1970s.
Right. There was one person, I guess he put his name on it. I don't know if it was a pseudonym or not, Al Frick. He was responsible for the scumbag remark and the report on his income and what a decent person he was. One of the things that there's an interesting, I guess.
Josh, before you go on, I want to say something about prison fellowship because I very much admire that work. In fact, I served for a number of years on the board of directors of prison fellowship. I know Chuck Colson personally and Mark Earley, who's the guy who directs it now, and the president and, many of the people who are around in the Angel Tree program. I also want to mention, which is a ministry of outreach to the families of prisoners, delivering Christmas presents to the kids and such like that, and trying to mitigate the, social damage to innocents, I mean literally innocents who are impacted by the whole thing. And the spirit, which is a, Christian spirit of charity and ministry, which even a, kind of guy who was a henchman for Richard Nixon can nevertheless embody. I mean, there's something really very nice about it. And yes, they are conservative. I mean, you could even say right-wing, And their politics would not be my politics. That's not why I'm not on the board. I didn't resign over any political thing. I didn't resign except for, it was time to move on in my life with what I was doing. But I'm just saying that's a good thing. And yes, these people who have offended against our laws are nevertheless human beings, and they're in our custody. This is a public enterprise, prisoning. Mm-hmm. It's something that we, the people of the United States of America, are doing. I mean, in fact, it's kind of the most political thing that we can do. We're using the force of the state. We're corralling people. We're, now about their desert of it and all of that. Yes, okay, so we can go into that. But nevertheless, it's something that we do so that it not be done humanely. There's a profound hypocrisy in building an institution with control of the lives of millions of people, and yet having it not, sort of reflect our values. I thought we were self-consciously a decent people. So I just want to say that. I'm sorry. I'm rambling,
it's important. But there's an issue here. Maybe this is the least interesting issue about the article and the conversation on the blog about it. But we have a delete button on our administration site for the website, and we do use the delete button sometimes. We use it when somebody puts up a link to some porn site. And it has nothing to do with the article. It's not even jailhouse porn. It's just somebody's trying to. And there are a few people who were, worried about the Freemasons running the country and, what's on the dollar bill and like that, so we delete those. But the general policy is that if somebody says something, pretty much, no matter how outrageous, that bears on the substance of the article, we keep it up there. And one of the one of the reasons for doing that is I guess we think it's better to err on the side of letting somebody say something that's, kind of awful and outrageous, and some of the things there are awful. Better to err on the side of letting somebody do that than to exclude somebody who says something that makes us a little uncomfortable, but it was important to say. Also, though, one of the things that I've been struck by here is that when people like this person, pseudonym or not, Al Frick, say this stuff, other people respond. And I'm, reminded here of the old Justice Brandeis remark that the best way to respond to speech is with more speech.
Right.
And most of those, the really outrageous comments have gone addressed. I don't say corrected, whatever that means, but it provokes a discussion. And that seems like the right policy.
I don't think there can be any doubt about that. That seems exact. I mean, I think it was John Stuart Mill probably made an argument to that effect even before Brandeis. But
absolutely,
I would, and I think it's important to know, what sort of what the edge is, the sort of visceral edge in people's reactions, and it's a constructive activity to have it refuted by other people.
There are. And sometimes you do learn things from things that are said. So, for example, in response, when we were on Blogging Heads a couple of weeks ago, the preponderance of the comments in response to our conversation was that I had spent much, much too much time talking, and the people were right. I had. So I'm trying to be better. I'm hoping, as Jesse Jackson said in 1988, God is not through with me yet, and I hope he's not going to make me a bigger blabbermouth. But no, I thought that criticisms were fair. But on this issue about the civility of public discourse, hot topic, as you know, the last week is the MoveOn.org ad about General Petraeus, and the ad in the Times that said Petraeus or betray us.
Yeah.
What do you think? Creepy schoolyard insult? Maybe he's a big boy.
No. I think I was disturbed by the tone of the ad. I mean, I'm also disturbed by the way that Petraeus is being used by the President of the United States. I mean, I've heard other people comment on this. The use of the military to make policy arguments. In a way, the president is kind of hiding behind the general. He's like arrogating his leadership responsibilities to some theory of expertise, which is rather odd to see Bush adopting at this late date, right? He's saying, this is the guy, the expert. He's going to tell me what to do, and I'm going to do it, which means I'm kind of off the hook until he tells me, and I'm going to manage the process by setting it up in this way, which, as I say, if only Petraeus and the Petraeus-like had been listened to in 2001, 2, 3, and 4, et cetera. But that's, why waste time? Why waste time saying that? I mean, I disagreed with the personalization of it, the kind of, imputation of motive and almost conspiracy theoretic. I thought it was probably a poor move politically, and I think the backlash aftermath is showing that, in that it, the guy he's bringing a lot of honor and sort of legitimacy to the table, and I mean to attack him without but I mean I also took it to be a measure of the frustration of the people who oppose the war, and I oppose the war with the sort of difficulty of the situation, which is that if the president can hold on to a third of the Congress, he can do what he wants to until he's not in office anymore. That's just the Constitution of the United States.
All time stay the course. Yeah, I mean I should kind of truth in advertising or truth in speech here. I've given support to MoveOn.org. The last time I sent them some money was after they were circulating this incredible Dick Cheney statement from 1994, in which in a minute and a half he brilliantly made the case against going to Baghdad in 1991. It was a very forceful statement. But I didn't really. I didn't like this too much. If they wouldn't ask me. They don't ask me. If they had asked me, I would have said that it's bad, a distraction. Of course, he's a big boy, and if he can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. And also, it's not nothing nearly as bad as what Admiral Fallon is alleged to have said about him, which is that he's a chicken shit and an ass kisser, and he can't stand people like that. Now, that's the story that's been running around. I don't really know that's been, I'm not sure, having not been at the meeting, and the Admiral hasn't confirmed that, but the Admiral is not a big fan of the surge and allegedly not a big fan of Petraeus. But I did think it was I suppose the proof that it's a ridiculous distraction from what's really a much more important set of issues about the war is the amount of attention that it's gotten as a consequence of Giuliani picking up on it and McCain picking up on it as well, and coming to the defense of the honor of General Petraeus, which, I don't know, seems kind of ridiculous overkill. But
but I just want to once again call attention to the damage to institutions that's being done by this administration. Yeah. I'm sorry that this sounds partisan. It is partisan. I don't see any way around it. Yeah. I mean, the damage to the institutions of the country. I mean, the Justice Department. I mean, it's mind-boggling. He was going to put Harriet Miers on the United States Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. I invite you to contemplate that. That's 1/9 of 1/3 of the state.
Yeah.
Okay. Based on what? On his personal relationship and the thinking that she was a good person and so forth? On some political calculation about placating whatever? I mean, it boggles the mind. Yeah. The United States Army can't take another war right now. If something were to happen somewhere, we're up the creek here. Yeah. I mean, something legitimate, something that really requires mobilization and response to, because we're overextended here. The stirring of the pot. I mean, I'm sorry if I rant, but I'm just boggled by it. The stirring of the pot over there in Iraq, Iran, and so forth has potentially catastrophic consequences. I mean, potentially, who knows where this thing ends up going the way that it's going. I'm just, I wonder how someone can retire from office after this kind of performance with all the wreckage in his train and then go into a peaceful retirement and live for another 30 years. You would think, it makes you wonder about systems where honor really meant something, where people, You know what I'm saying? But I'm just saying. As you know, I feel the need to put this in here. As you know, when I look out my window, what I'm now seeing is Don Rumsfeld's new office, because Don Rumsfeld is now, I call him Don as if he and I were good buddies. Donald Rumsfeld is going to be spending the next year as a distinguished fellow affiliated with the Hoover Institution. And, I think it's shameless that he was invited there. I'm not going to get into the issues about whether or not he should be excluded or whatever, but let's just talk about whether or not he should have been invited. This is a guy who's done really, really severe damage to people in Iraq, to the American military, to the political institutions in the country. And the idea that he gets, the equivalent for a political figure of a kind of golden parachute for an executive who brought the company down. I think it's really it's a disgraceful piece of behavior. But listen, maybe when Dick Cheney is out on January 20th, 2009, Dick Cheney will also end up here. I know that Condi is planning on coming back here, and I have to say this: I'm really unhappy about that, but for one thing, which is Condi Rice may right now be what stands between us and a war in Iran. And if on January 21st, 2009, we haven't gone to war with Iran, I'll give her, not somebody who I really approve of much, but I will give her a good bit of credit for having done that, but she'll end up back here also. So I think does honor matter at all? Do standards matter at all, either intellectual standards or moral standards or standards of basic decency? Apparently, with my friends literally within eyesight, apparently not. I think this is really shameful. Well, people are going to say something about free speech, and I guess, it's a private institution, and I gather autonomous. The Hoover Institute must be autonomous relative to Stanford in its basic structure. So people will say, it's a free country. I mean, I would say the problem for a university is that, this is American Enterprise Institute on, in 17th Street in Northwest Washington, D.C., that's one thing. If this is an endowed institute that sits right in the middle of the campus of a great university and has all manner of interaction with its intellectual life and public identification with its brand, then it's quite another, right? I mean, the imprimatur that's being given here is something that affects other people who are connected up with the institution. I would think.
Absolutely. I mean, that's why I don't see this as, in the first instance, as a free speech issue, because I'm not talking about whether or not the invitation should be rescinded or whether or not he should be able to write books and speech. I think that people shouldn't have invited him. They should have. People who care about the state of the world and the state of the country and the state of the security of the country and the state of the basic political and military institutions of the country should have stayed away from this guy. He's done a lot of serious damage, and instead of treating him as part of as a big part of the problem, he's now treated as part of an important conversation. George Shultz is a fellow of the Hoover Institution. He'll be part of a conversation with George Shultz, part of an important conversation about the future of security policy in the country. I think it's shameless to do that, not in the first instance a free speech issue, but an issue about intellectual judgment and political judgment and moral judgment to the people who are involved in this.
I want to play devil's advocate with you here, Josh, because I think it'll be interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, basically, I agree with you, and if I had a vote, I would have cast it against Rumsfeld. But what I'm going to say is, well, the man was Secretary of Defense and high government official in the councils of government at a critical time in history. He has a lot of embodied personal... there can't be any doubt that he has expertise on the matter that's relevant here, which is what was the government doing in the critical years between 2001 and 2007, or whenever he stepped down. And so he's almost by definition an expert on that. I don't see how, for example, if I were going to have a war game or some kind of high council to contemplate how I think critical actors might react to some crisis at some point of the world, if I had Donald Rumsfeld at the table, it would probably be a richer and more interesting conversation for his presence there. So it seems like a case along those lines could be made, to which then what one has to say. I mean, I think I agree with you, but there's something missing from your argument, which is, we have a responsibility to sanction the wrongdoer.
Yeah.
Even when he would bring something to the table.
Right.
The act of sanction is a little bit like O.J. Simpson, right? You don't invite him to dinner.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Right.
Or anywhere else.
Right. Or anywhere else. Right. So I guess the way
and all of us have that. That's a social responsibility because it's a public good, right? Sanctioning, it might be in our private interest to do business with the wrongdoer, but we really ought to maintain the taboo out of a sense of respect for our commonality of purpose and our values and something like that.
Right. And this is a guy who's shown a lot of disrespect for other people. I agree with you about that. I think there is that piece missing from the argument. But, just to underscore in just what ways I agree. There are all sorts of people who would bring expertise to a discussion, and you don't want to invite them to the discussion. So when, after Saddam Hussein was arrested and going on trial, he knew a lot about his country. He wasn't invited to be a distinguished fellow here. Now, I'm not making an argument about the moral equivalence of Saddam Hussein and Donald Rumsfeld.
Of course not.
What I'm saying, though, is that you got to draw the line someplace, and they wouldn't have invited Saddam Hussein for very good reason.
How much of this, I find it interesting. I mentioned O.J. Simpson, and it reminded me of, I went to the Million Man March, and whenever it was back in 1995, 96, whatever it was. And I saw T-shirts, O.J. didn't do it, or, whatever. And what I thought was, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I thought, nobody really believes that.
Right.
I thought, it's just that it gives them an occasion to voice some kind of opposition to something else.
Right.
Okay, and likewise, Rumsfeld is vilified by MoveOn.org and everybody else. And if you were a trustee of the Hoover Institution or somewhere, you might think, this is our guy. You might think, to join in the blacklisting would be to kind of team up with, the lefties that so.
Right.
But I think that's a mistake. At the end of the day, I think you're tearing down the social. You're poisoning the well of the social value when you.
As much of a believer in solidarity as the next guy. Probably not. I'm not it's not that big, not that high up on my scale of values. So, but I understand that you want to express solidarity with somebody. But the flip side of expressing that solidarity is an issue about responsibility. So here's somebody, he's being vilified. You think he's one of us. Well, the fact that he's one of you may give you all the more reason for taking a strong position of distinguishing yourself from him. And I think in this circumstance, what they've done is said, no, this is somebody who's got not just knowledge, but a certain kind of wisdom about the American national security policy. And that, I think, is a terrible view.
Well, you can, and moreover, to think, the imperial president, what does the guy stand for? I mean, you could argue that he's a war criminal almost. I mean, I know that language sounds very, very extreme, but what I mean by that is that you could say that in the scheme of things, when you sort of look at, the threat to the Constitution, when you look at his, what we hear from all these reports, all these books, bureaucratic infighting that neutered other voices within the administration about policies that were really very important.
Right.
Anyway.
This is somebody who did not, who, according to all reports, of course, you don't know, I don't know where, but we're relying on things that people say, and it's pretty much uncontested, is that this was not a guy who you'd want to be part of a discussion with because he's not a discusser. He didn't believe in, sitting around and, talking about things and sharing opinions and people disagree and you listen to reason. This was a guy who was a kind of a bully, a bureaucratic infighter at best and a bully. And so doesn't really, fit in with the culture of an academic institution or a research institution. But there are... there are bigger and, I suppose, certainly bigger and more important issues than Donald Rumsfeld coming.
I just want to say, Josh, I think you're letting Condi off too easily here.
Yeah. No, well.
I mean, I saw Bill Moyer's a rerun of his thing that he did on the 9/11 Commission. I saw a testimony before the 9/11 Commission. Man, I just, this was about whether Richard Clark, the intelligence expert inside the National Security Council, who was worried about Al Qaeda operation and whether or not there had been sufficient, coordination of high-level people by her in response to the memoranda that were coming to her attention for the president about the threat of possible attack inside the country and so forth. Her performance during the war in 2006 in Lebanon, and, my humble opinion, of course, it's not going to be universally shared in the United States, but I think in the opinion of many people throughout the world, was less than what it might have been. And, I mean, she's been an architect and spokesperson on behalf of this absurd, so I hate to be piling on, but, it's now evidently erroneous and dangerously erroneous view that, we were going to somehow remake the Middle East by planning democracy. The president is still continuing to say these things.
Singing that tune still, That was lunacy last week. But just last point on Condi, I mean, I think her performance in the administration has been, I think it's terrible, disgraceful. I think for somebody who's come out of an academic, the department I'm sitting in right now, the Stanford Political Science Department, she was provost of this university, the contempt shown in the decision-making in all parts of the Bush administration, but in security policy, among others, for research, knowledge, what people who know something about a region of the world think, believe, judge on the basis of some, experience, knowledge, and study. Total contempt for that. So I think the idea of her coming back to the university fills me with what can I say? Unhappiness. But I all of that said, disgraceful performance. Disastrous for the country, disastrous for Iraq, terrible. All of that said, I think on the scale of disasters, we ain't seen nothing yet. If there's an attack on Iran. Now, I don't know anything more than what I read in the papers, and also what I hear from people who do know her and know something about the way the conversations are going about about Iran policy in particular. And my impression from those conversations confirms what you read in the papers, which is that she's playing a more positive role there. And it doesn't fully compensate for the misdeeds, but I think I would be prepared to give a fair bit of credit for her doing that.
I agree with that. I agree with that 100%. I want to say though that it raises in my mind, that we sit here fearful that the country will attack Iran, or that there will be, and I don't know enough about this kind of thing to know exactly how it could play out at a practical level, but that such an action, such an initiative would be undertaken at this point, with the president's approval ratings below 30%, with the universly proclaimed fiasco. I mean, you got Chuck Hagel, Republican senator, Nebraska, virtually screaming from in the hearing room about how So now to then do this on top of that. I don't, this is what impeachment is for. And again, I don't want to sound like some wild-eyed radical, but I'm saying, what are our options? We're supposed to be a democracy here.
Yeah.
Why are we sitting fearful that he's going to do something that only Condi stands in the way? When I don't see how a plebiscite to do this could ever carry the day. Not that you want to do military and foreign policy by plebiscite, but I'm saying,
it would be a disaster. Unfortunately, if we don't do it, the French may get there first. They are talking about military action. The new government with the foreign minister, who is the Doctors Without Borders guy, Bernard Kouchner, has been talking about the possibilities of not just French, but a kind of Euro military action vis-a-vis Iran in case of the disastrous news. But let's talk about Iraq itself for a few minutes here. And I just want to mention, before we get into the conversation, this terrible news that came out over the past week about, you saw the op-ed piece that those 7 NCOs wrote in the New York Times last month, and it was very powerfully stated, very powerfully argued. By the time, my understanding is that by the time the piece had come out, one of those guys had been shot in the head, and then the report came in the past week that two of the other co-authors of it were killed in action. And the fact that the Giulianis and the McCains of the world are running around, pardon my language, but pissing on Hillary Clinton for for not having said exactly the right thing to General Petraeus, and they're not concerned about the fact that that these guys who'd written this very powerful statement, both embracing their willingness to do their duty, but exposing the policy. I think it's a shame. I mean, I feel a certain personal connection to this because we had actually thought about at Boston Review about running an earlier piece that a group of those guys, not the same group of 7, but that some of those guys had done, and decided not to do it because given our time horizons, etc., it was a little bit too focused on some tactical issues and didn't have a broader sense about the political situation. But just a terrible thing. But I just wanted to say that on the Petraeus Crocker, I don't know, did you have a chance to watch the hearings at all or read the...
Yeah, I saw some of the hearings and followed some of it on television and in the print. I also want to say something about the 7, though, and about the... just a couple of things. I mean, I think it's it's an exemplary aspect of our democracy that piece appeared in the New York Times. I mean, I just think, and so you can imagine that, like in Russia, that wouldn't happen.
Right. Yeah.
So, I mean, Russia today, Putin's Russia.
Right.
But, so that's one point. The other point is,
important point.
Real thinking people get their brains blown out over there. And the reality that is brought home when I didn't have any personal connection, but I read the piece and I saw the controversy around it, and I kind of identified with these guys as people going through something and thinking about it. And then the next thing I know, this person to whom I now have this, thin connection has been obliterated. Is no longer, the very person who was sitting around 24 hours ago thinking about this is now no longer a sentient being. That grips us, and it makes us, it makes me anyway realize this is real. This is war. People are dying. Our people are dying. People like me are dying. And that, it's kind of because of the fact that we're not really mobilized as a society, and there isn't really any deep ideological motivation for the undertaking that's being done here. And we've kind of privatized and voluntarized our security participation so that now, our connections to it are not as thick as they otherwise might be, at least given my social location. They're not. I don't have people with flags flying off their front porches to the left or the right of my house in my neighborhood in Brookline. I don't say we're unpatriotic. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I'm just saying not that many. When my former colleague at Boston University, Andrew Basevich, the security expert, lost his son, Andrew Jr., in Iraq. And, I knew Andrew Basevich. I didn't know Andrew Jr. But I mean, and now I'm writing to him, trying to, convey condolences and, express sympathy and friendship. And I'm thinking, and there are thousands of people like this, and so, okay, I mean, that's what I want to say about that. Crocker and Petraeus, the hearings,
Yeah. What'd you think? Did you have a...
Well, I was impressed by this guy, Tom Ricks, the book, The Fiasco, the guy that writes for the Washington Post, he's been over in Iraq a lot, when he said, these were the guys who at the beginning of this were kind of on the outs and weren't listened to and who were critics. And now the policy is in their hands. And the least we can do is hear them out. So I thought that, and that's one reason why I thought General Petraeus or General Betraeus was over the top and unnecessary. I thought, well, it's scripted to a certain degree, and, everything has been set up so that it was delayed from before to September, but now we get here and we see really it's just going to be pushed off, and we see really the reality is that kind of we're going to be in there in one way or another for some time. And so on. I don't know what a new Democratic president might do in 2009, but it looks like a involvement for some time is a possibility that because you have to I was maybe I want to say persuaded. I mean, I do take seriously not only because of the testimony from Petraeus and Crocker, but all of the discussion leading up to it, the idea that you have to look at the options that you have, not at the ones that you wish you had. And there aren't any good options, and walking away and without any regard to the consequences of what might ensue isn't a really doesn't sound to me like a smart thing necessarily to do. So I'm not one of these people who says let's just get everybody out as soon as we can and just sort of forget about it. I mean, we obviously need a strategy, in getting out. So,
I mean, I guess I kind of agree in some ways. That is, I thought, I don't know, maybe I was taken in by them or suckered or something. I mean, I thought these were serious, smart, focused guys who were really trying to, what can I say, make the best of a bad situation, of a really bad situation. Putting aside, though, the issues about whether there's been an improvement on the ground or not, and there is some serious argument about whether the numbers that they were presenting are right or not. I thought there were two essential points that they were both making. I'm putting aside the fantasy land speech that the president gave on Thursday night. First of all, they think that this was not and is not a war of choice, that it's a war of necessity. Now, I don't know exactly what that means, but it's a common phrase that's used. This is something where it's really important they think it's really important to be fighting this. It was important, it remains important, and you can't really walk away from it. And the second thing that they think is that though political reconciliation is obviously essential to moving forward, that in order to get any kind of political reconciliation, you've got to deal first with the security issue. You can't get people reconciling and talking to each other and making political deals if they're worried about getting shot at. And I guess on those two premises, I just have never, I don't accept the first. I think this was a war of choice from the beginning. I think it was a mistaken fight to go in, and I'm still not convinced that it's really, essential to be, continuing the fight now. And I'm not so sure about, even if you accept that it's an important thing, I'm not so sure that I accept the second, that you can't get, this is really, I thought, the disagreement between a bunch of the Democratic critics and some of the Republican critics as well, and Petraeus and Crocker. I'm not so sure that it's right that you can get that the security first idea really does make that much sense. You'll get a little security today, and then the security will disappear tomorrow if there isn't some kind of political reconciliation. I mean, this is the story that people tell about the cooperation, the Sunni cooperation in Anbar province. They didn't like the daughters being raped and friends being, brothers and sisters being murdered by Al Qaeda in Iraq, and so they line up with the United States. But the numbers of people to the extent that you're able to do surveys in Anbar province, and people have done them, the numbers of people who want the United States out of Anbar province is very high.
Yeah,
and all it takes a little bit of something to flip. So I don't accept the war of necessity thing, and I'm not so sure about the security. I don't really believe the security first argument. I guess the other thing that's important here is that the whole conversation about the policy, arguments between people who are opposed to it and arguments and people who are strongly in favor of it, for a whole bunch of reasons, historical and political, just accepts now that the number of troops can't go above 160. And it was going to be dropping back down to 150, 130 pre-surge levels in any case. Right. And that's a constraint on the policy. And there's only so much that you can do.
Right.
And so there's a serious position that says, in a way, maybe like if you followed out the logic of the Shinseki position going in, is we should have gone in with 300,000 or not gone in at all. And if we're not prepared to go to 300,000 now, whether that's a good idea or not, having a force in there of 80,000, 100,000, 80,000, 40,000 doesn't make any sense. Militarily, unless maybe the role is going to be reduced to a kind of training.
Yeah, I think what it is that it's really a transition to getting out, which is giving you cover, and it's kind of the current president playing out the string a little bit. I follow that logic, and I think I agree with it very much. That is that if going in, you really need it in order to pacify the country after defeating the army twice or three times as many men as you and women as you had. Then now, if we're talking about security first as the thing, and if you're seeing some success, it seems to point in the direction of more troops, not fewer troops, if you wanted to play the thing actually.
And that's not even McCain, who was talking that way for a while, is not saying that anymore. And on the Republican side, it's not something. Giuliani is running ahead of the pack. It's certainly not the kind of thing that Giuliani is saying. I mean, I guess the big issues here are, you don't want Iraq to be Afghanistan 2001, or some might say, Barack Obama, for example, might say you don't want it to be Pakistan 2007. That's one thing. You don't want there to be a big regional war, which would be even more catastrophic than the current situation is. And you don't want to worsen the humanitarian disaster in Iraq more than it already is, though let's be clear, it's really, it's horrible. A couple of million people outside the country,
and now 2 million displaced inside.
Yeah, and millions displaced inside, and now Syria is shutting off the border. They don't want anybody. There are a lot.
Well, and those stories that are coming out of Syria are absolutely horrible. I'm sure you've been reading them. About women selling themselves in order to survive,
Right.
and
Right.
all
Right.
this terrible stuff. I mean,
We have a very good piece in the next Boston Review by Nir Rosen, who's spent a lot of the last 4 years in Iraq, and he's been writing more recently about refugees, and his piece is about Syria, Jordan, and displaced Iraqis in the northern part in the Kurdish part of the country.
But these all sound like arguments for staying. I mean, the arguments that you're making that about
I don't know, but I think they might be, but
or
I don't
at least
think they are.
staying in the context of some I don't know, multilateral, regional sort of understanding. I don't know enough about this stuff to speak intelligently. I'm just thinking, the situation with Iran, for example. So, of course they're making mischief in Iraq. I mean, who can be surprised at that?
Right.
And yes, there's a Shia revival and awakening going on. That would also seem to be really quite evident, and we perhaps have contributed to stirring a hornet's nest here.
Right. That was a reason that people gave in advance for not going in. That was a reason that people gave in advance for not going in.
I'm just wondering why. Because people will start whispering the word defeat. I mean, for example, if someone were to say, "Let's come to terms with Iran," let's. I'm not advocating anything here because, as I say, I don't know enough to be trying to make policy. But I'm just saying, just the form of it would be, let's come. I can imagine what AIPAC is going to say about that.
Yeah.
Friends of Israel are going to say no, and a whole lot of other people as well. I can imagine what those people sitting over in Hoover are going to say.
Right.
They're going to say you're defeatist. If a Democratic president actually were to give some ground to try to reach some kind of accommodation in that region that would involve acknowledging an expansion of Iran's influence and power beyond what it had been before we did what we did, the forces against that would be very substantial. And he would be called a sellout and a traitor, or she, and I don't know if it could be done.
I'm just in fairness to my, Hoover can be surprising from the outside, but a pretty diverse place. And my friend Abbas Milani, who's a fellow at Hoover, has been writing about how the worst thing that the United States can do is be putting a lot of visible and military pressure on Iran, because what it does is it strengthens the authoritarian, the worst authoritarian strands within the regime, and is injurious to the democratic movement that's indigenous to Iran. And there is a line of, and this is also, the line of argument that's most powerfully presented by Akbar Ganji, who was spent 80 days on hunger strike in Iran, was eventually released. Probably the only person in history who's won the support of both George Bush and Noam Chomsky. Support for getting him out of jail. He's a wonderful and decent person, and he's been also emphasizing, he's not at Hoover, Abbas is, but emphasizing how disastrous it is for the United States to be out front in putting pressure on Iran if what you're looking for is democratization in Iran. But I feel I know Abbas very well. He's a very decent and good person who's been at some cost to himself, I'm sure, making this argument and making it very powerfully. But I guess when I look at if avoiding a really vastly worse humanitarian disaster and preventing a regional, a disastrous regionalization of the war and keeping Iraq from becoming Afghanistan 2001 demanded an American military presence, then I'm prepared to follow out the logic of my own premises. I just don't believe that for a second. I think that the humanitarian disaster is already horrible and getting worse, and I don't think the United States is going to be able to do much to prevent that damage. I think the American presence probably fuels tendency, the trajectory of regionalization of the conflict, and also does, over the medium and longer term, does present a threat of turning Iraq into Afghanistan 2001, or, again, to paraphrase Barack Obama, Pakistan 2007. In addition, I don't think that is a case for the United States keeping a military presence in Iraq. I also think this is there's nothing like fighting a war to focus all your attention on fighting the war and none of your attention on anything else. I mean, there are a lot of people who work in there are only so many things you can pay attention to. There's some principle of divided attention. And until there are a few other problems in the world that strike me as worth some attention. Climate disaster, gross destitution for large numbers of people in large parts of the world, avoiding a nuclear 9/11, and having an effective security policy in that region. And I think the military presence, I don't think, is really doing any good in addressing those issues either. So I think the Warner question. So overall, is this helping the security of the country or not?
Oh yes, right.
You can't. That's the big one, and I thought they kind of punted on. Those guys punted on that.
Yeah.
We're almost out of time. We can't let the time pass though without a little bit on Alan Greenspan's new book, which both of us are, speaking of topics on which we're experts, neither of us has read it at all, I guess. Maybe.
Well, no, I haven't read the book. I read the excerpt that was in wherever it was, Newsweek or somewhere, and there's been some commentary on it. Paul Krugman had a column this morning.
Yeah, I read that.
I am an expert insofar as I'm an economist,
right.
And so I was actually, the excerpt that I read seemed very smart in terms of a certain kind of, broadly gauged, macro, global, pan-historic view of a wise policymaker. I mean, he really pulls it off. I think now I know Krugman is going to go ballistic if he hears. I mean, he and I were at MIT together, and he was blasting Greenspan for his endorsing the Bush tax cuts early on in the first George W. Bush administration, which I agree were ill-considered and part of the crazy fiscal policy that we've been having in this country under Republican presidents. The last 25 years, but on the whole, I thought, and Greenspan's list, he sort of frames the book around the idea of what will the world be like in 2030. He's sort of prognosticating, where are we going? And the list of things, he says, will there be the rule of law? And will free markets reign? Well, I sure hope so.
Yeah. Yeah. Those are big questions,
and then he says, but what about environment? What about terrorism? And then he puts up there in his top 5, fixing the public schools in the United States so that we prepare a skilled workforce that continues to allow us to be competitive in the global context.
Yeah.
And I thought, I could.
There was a survey that I saw reported, I think it was reported in the Times yesterday. I was thinking of you as I read it, which is that there was a survey done. It was an article about the presence of crime on the political agenda and about how none of the candidates, including Giuliani, are making anything about crime issues by sharp contrast with 15 years ago. But then there was a kind of a city by city breakdown, and Philadelphia people are really concerned about crime, but in New York City, maybe Greenspan is thinking about 3 times as many people in New York think that the big issue that needs to be addressed are the schools and not crime. Only 7% think that crime, personal security is a big issue. 22% think schools are the big issue. But so the other thing that's been reported about the book, but not in that excerpt, is the business about Iraq, that the Iraq War was about oil.
Yeah.
I haven't read what he says about that. I've seen the reports on it. I guess if what he's saying is it was about oil in the sense that they wouldn't have gone in if there weren't a lot of oil in that region, who could disagree with that? Who could possibly disagree with that? But no big news. Although I suppose the fact that he says it is some news. I guess the other big news is that Bill Clinton is his hero. So here you've got.
Well, that's not actually. Or at least versions of that story were coming out even toward the end of the Clinton presidency, as I recall, that he and Clinton had really a sort of compact or an understanding. And in fact, the fiscal discipline advances under the Clinton administration in historical perspective are very impressive.
So, here you've got Bill Clinton, who's, people say, the first black president. He's Ayn Rand reincarnated.
Oh,
And
yeah,
the only
that
thing
is
that you
cute.
could
I
say
see what you
negative
mean, yeah.
about him, Mitt Romney said that in comparing the spouses of the presidential candidates, Mitt Romney did say that he thought that his wife, that Mitt Romney's own wife, was prettier than Bill Clinton.
Okay.
I guess I would rather. I don't think he's too worried about that, and I get praise from Alan Greenspan for his fiscal discipline, his heroic fiscal discipline.
I just want to comment on, was the war about oil or is the war about oil?
Yeah.
I mean, yes, in some macro and mega sense, the reason that we care about Iraq environs has a lot to do with the implications of, if the flow of oil is cut off, what are the consequences of that?
Yeah.
Although, of course, that's an overly simplistic story about the war, you would have to say, if that were the holy thing. I mean, there is another point to make here, which is that oil is sold in a global market, and, the price that we pay for oil and the quantity of oil that's going to be available is determined by, the whole global situation, which, I mean to say it has two implications. One is that any one country isn't, the be-all and end-all of the thing, but the other is that everybody has a stake in what happens in that market.
I agree. That's why I think it's, if somebody tells me that the war was about oil in that sense, that it was, that they wouldn't have fought there had it not been for the oil. I mean, I do think that the, provision of, a supply of energy is a kind of global public good. I wish the supplies of energy didn't happen to be located in really bad neighborhoods and, this is something that we ought to be focusing a little bit more attention on rather than the inevitable attention that gets focused on when you're fighting a war.
I guess that's what makes geopolitics interesting. It's more interesting than the board game Risk, which I love, which is we don't have oil fields located in particular places. It could be a more interesting game if you did. Right. But I wanted to say something about Greenspan, which is. So he blessed the policymaking process in the administration as being overly politicized. He says these first couple of secretaries of Treasury had no influence whatsoever. He says the Republican Congress, sort of completely had no spine in terms of managing economic policy, and that they were craven and they deserved to lose.
Right.
I thought that was...
It's powerful stuff. I mean, as people have said, and I guess it bears repetition. Anyway, whether or not it does, I'll repeat it. It would have been nice if he had said it when it might have mattered.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose you could say it still does matter that this really might make a difference to people's views about 2008, since there isn't, there's not a lot of bright line on the economic policy making side between Bush and, as far as I can tell, between Bush and Giuliani. Giuliani sells himself as a big tax cutter. Never met a tax cut that he didn't love, and there was a debate recently about whether or not the supply side views about tax cutting are dead in the Republican Party, and I think Tyler Cowen's blog had some materials on this, and you look at the quotations from Giuliani and from McCain, and it really looks like that view is alive and well. Now, to be fair, I mean, the Greenspan argument is not that the problem with these guys is that they were supply-siders. The problem was that they were crazy spendthrifts, no discipline. Well, really the problem was, it's just what you said, is that everything has been subsumed under the crass political calculation.
Oh, yes, indeed.
Science subjected to crass political calculation. People in New Orleans, crass political calculation. All of this stuff. It's really, for those of us who think politics isn't such a bad thing, it really gives politics a bad name.
But it makes me think about, this could be a subject for another conversation since it's so late in the hour now, but it makes me think about, what really is the legacy here for conservatism? Right, so Alan Greenspan is certainly an embodiment, as you say, of one. He's an Ayn Rand libertarian, but also a very pragmatic guy who's in charge of the money supply for a decade, and he's one brand of conservative.
Right.
And yet it seems to me that, the defeat of the Republicans in the House and the Senate in 2006, the impending disaster, I mean, all the signs are, everybody's running for cover. It looks like, this could be a very, very bad year for the Republicans coming up. And you think about, this was supposed to be 1,000-year Reich.
Yeah.
People will get mad at me for using the metaphor, but you see what I'm saying. They were going to be reigning forever. They were going to they were going to remake Iraq around privatization ideas.
Right.
So much arrogance, so much surety, that they had figured it out.
Yeah.
And now it all seems to be turning to ashes. I mean, all of these brilliant, iconoclastic conservative and neoconservative intellectuals are tainted and besmirched. And I just wonder what we're sort of back to square one on a lot of stuff where you thought, the welfare state was a terrible thing. We tried to cure poverty and poverty won. Yeah. Taxes have to go to zero. Right. Somehow privatizing Social Security, it's all a joke now.
Right. I mean, I don't know if I agree. I sort of feel, what do I know, but I sort of feel like some sort of turning of the tide on a bunch of these arguments. I noticed that, Hillary Clinton came out with a health plan yesterday. She said, it's going to cost $110 billion, and what you're going to hear from my Republican opponents is that this is, the state running your lives, and we're not going to let them win that fight again. I thought, good that she's finally come out so strongly on this issue. Edwards was there first in this campaign, but whatever. Who's worried about the competition and for who's coming first? But I think it's important that that she's out there. So I do think that there is some. On the one hand, I think it does feel like maybe there's some turning of the tide. On the other hand, I can say that the conventional wisdom among Democrat, like local Democratic office holders and Democratic Party functionaries, is that Hillary is the inevitable winner of the Democratic nomination, and then she will lose the general election, probably to Giuliani.
Oh my God!
Yes, and that, by the way, I mean that's the conventional wisdom. It's also the way the polling is going. She's running way ahead of Obama. In fact, it's really opened up again.
Yeah, I know.
And when you put her head to head against Giuliani, Giuliani wins. But this is what I'm going to take your comment as an invitation to be continued.
Yeah, let's continue it because I want to explore that scenario in the hopes of keeping it from happening.
Okay. Wonderful to talk, Glenn. Okay.
Yeah, me too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.